Alright guys, now let's see what are the different properties inside the grid system. So the grid system is also divided into two parts. That means some of the properties can be applied on the parent and some of the properties can be applied to the children, similar to the flexbox. As I've already mentioned earlier that you may find some of the similarities between CSS Grid and flexbox. So similarly here also some of the properties is particularly for the grid container or parent, as well as some of the properties will be for the grid items or children. So properties for the parent are display grid template columns, grid template rows, grid template areas, grid template, grid column gap, etc, etc. Yeah, and few properties for the children are grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end, and so on. Yeah, similar to the flexbox. Yeah, here we have container. So this is the parent that we have already understood that this is the grid container. So to the grid container we can apply all of these properties for the parent. And what about the item? Here we have, this is the item. So to the item, this is the item. So to this item we can apply all of these properties. Perfect. Now let's see all of these properties and values one by one. So we will start with the properties for the parent, that is the grid container. Yeah, the very first property for the parent is display properties. We have already seen this display property earlier in our first video. Yeah, the display property defines the element as a grid container and establishes a new grid formatting context for its content, and it accepts two values, that is grid generates a block level grid and inline grid generates a inline level grid. Similar to the flex, you know what a flex value will do for the display property and what will do the inline flex. So similarly here we have grid and inline grid. Let's see this. Okay, to the container here we've applied display grid, and this is one of the most property for the grid system. That is, until and unless you won't apply this display grid property, you may not enter the grid system. Then only you can make use of other properties inside the grid template columns, grid template rows, or the properties for the children, etc, etc. Yeah, so this is the display grid and this is how it looks like. Yeah, that's the block level grid actually. And thereafter we have inline grid also. Let's see that inline grid. Yeah, save this. Okay, display inline grid. Now let's have a look of inline grid. Give it a refresh. You can see earlier the block grid, which was just a display grid, was taking whole horizontal space, and these are the paddings that I have applied for the body. So that's why it is not starting from the starting point. Okay, we were talking about the grid and inline grid. The grid value for the display property generates block level grid, so it was taking whole horizontal space, and inline grid will generate inline level grid, so that's why it is taking the space according to the content it has inside it. Yeah, that's the difference between grid and inline grid.